year later from me finishing this thing, and it feels like everything is just getting worse. So one of the things that is getting worse, and that the reason that I'm reading from this particular section tonight is because I'm really thinking about the damage that Hurricane Helene just did in places that we don't think of as getting flattened by hurricanes, in like western North Carolina in the mountains. And yeah, so I do not have that in the book, but I do have some other storms. So I wanted to read a little bit here, and then we'll have a conversation for a little bit, and then we'll ask you all to join our conversation. So this is towards the end of the book, in the last chapter. The climate crisis became real for me in 2005, when I, like most people, watched Hurricane Katrina happen on TV. The difference was that I had lived in New Orleans not that long before. So I spent the days and then weeks trawling around for updates, calling and emailing people, scanning the news broadcasts for the faces of people that I didn't know how to reach, a neighbor whose name I was never quite sure of, the guy who fixed my car, a favorite bartender, all the little contacts that make up a life. Before Katrina, no one in New Orleans really believed that the city could drown, that the rest of the country would let it. After Katrina, no one can ever forget. It was a clear and visible reminder that for some people, help does not come in times of need. New Orleans made me. It made me resilient, but it also made me look up and down as well as side to side before I crossed the street. It taught me that the threats can be under your feet, that the terrain will shift, that the street will not look the same month by month, that when the rain and the winds come, everything can disappear. I learned to love and to let go there. Sometimes it still, even nearly 20 years later, cracks me open to think of all that happened then. I moved back to New Orleans in 2021, wanting to live there once again before the rest of the world lets it go for good. Wanting to be part of the place that shaped me again. I found it both exactly the same and entirely different, haunted with a new layer of ghosts. When I was there the first time, when a hurricane approached us in the fall of 1998, I recall the rumors that abounded that the city had rigged the levees to blow along the poorer edges of the city in order to spare the French Quarter and the tourist attractions. The stories were untrue, but close enough to what had happened in 1927 when levees were dynamited during the Great Flood, to what did happen in 2005, that I understood why people believed them. Katrina killed almost 2,000 people directly and destroyed the homes of many thousands more. Nearly 1 million people were displaced and many never came back. So much we know. We know, too, that so many of those who were displaced and killed were poor and black, the same people who had made New Orleans the city that it was, created jazz and second lines, and cooked the food that the tourists eat. We know there were vigilante killings and police killings, that Blackwater, the private security firm used to provide soldiers for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, patrolled New Orleans streets. Perhaps we recall that the first piece of rebuilding was the conversion of the Greyhound bus station into a jail to hold those accused of looting, as if everything they produced had not been looted for generations. As geographer and New Orleanian Lydia Palo-Hobbs noted, the primary shelter the city offered so many survivors was a jail cell. Katrina taught us that disasters would not discriminate, but the state sure would, that some buildings would withstand floodwaters and others would collapse, that black people would be left to drown, and some people would turn away precisely because the dying were not enough like them. That disasters last longer than the news cycle and leave scars that never fade. That grief lingers, even after you think it has finished remaking you. New Orleans is a city shaped by its grief, its traditions of mourning visible everywhere. The best and least known of them is the Second Line Parade, rooted in black working-class neighborhoods. The Second Line is many things at once. Intertwined with funeral culture, it is a celebration that marks anniversaries and protests violence and claims the city's segregated streets for itself. Participants in the tradition often own very little, but during the parade, they own the streets. The Second Line creates a safe space to cross boundaries, real or imagined, to honor the dead and fight for the living, to insist on the value of an ordinary life lived in sometimes brutal circumstances, and the joy in that life, in the areas of the city that the tourists don't visit, which the floodwaters overtook. Like the music that accompanies it, the second line blends cultures and histories together, creating different relationships than would otherwise be possible in the post-industrial city. It challenges ideas of respectability and the work ethic, offering up a different idea of a life well lived, one that treasures relationships and mutual aid rather than one that accumulates stuff. If you follow it, it will lead you somewhere you have never been, and then leave you to find your own way home. You will find the real city beyond the disasters and the advertisements and the illusions of safety. New Orleans has made something beautiful out of hundreds of years of death and pain, colonization and slavery, wars and exploitation. And I'll stop there before I depress you anymore. Thank you. So I invited these two wonderful people here to join me, like I said, because they are both in my book. Kat has actually been in 2 of my books. And I was saying I have launched all 3 books at Magers and Quinn. So second one virtually, but still. So it's great to be back here. And yeah, I'm really pleased to be in Minneapolis because obviously writing a book about grief and the world on fire in the 2020s had to start with the George Floyd uprisings, right? And yeah, so I obviously had to come here and be here to think about grief and how that affects our political lives, our personal lives, the world that we have to deal with. And yeah, I wanted to start out because, actually, let me start out by sharing mine because this is the reason that I ended up telling this book as partly a memoir is because I couldn't sit down and be like, so tell me your grief story without sharing that the reason that I'm writing about this at all is because my father died 6 years ago and it completely upended the way that I look at the world. And it really upended the way that I looked at all of the things that I was already writing about, the way that I was writing about labor and social movements and the world, and thought, oh, I've been writing about grief this whole time, but I didn't recognize it. Yeah, and so, but both of you did tell me sort of grief stories when we were first talking for this book. And so I wonder if you'd be willing to share a little bit about how grief helped make you an organizer. I don't know who wants to go first, or I can just.
I'm just gonna pick me.
Yeah.
Well, you.
I mean, so for me, I grew up, I claim Minneapolis is like my second home, but I grew up on the west side of Chicago. I would say working class. I want to say working class. We're really just like really low income. Like my grandmother migrated from Mississippi in the 1970s with my father. My maternal grandmother migrated to Chicago in the 1930s. One pulled themselves up by the bootstraps. So my paternal grandmother and their story, grew up with nothing. They grew up in the Henry Horner projects through the 1980s, and watching like my family, be really devastated by the crack epidemic, and later after that, the war on drugs. My uncle, who is mentioned in the book, he was an organizer, and he saw organizing as a way in which not only to change the wrongs or what he saw wrong in the community, but also as a way in which to fight back. He is the reason I knew anything about community organizing. I remember being 9 years old and sitting in a room, not a bookstore, but a room sort of like this one with a bunch of older black folks, and they were all yelling. I didn't know what they were yelling about. I didn't know why they were yelling, but they were, they were pissed. Come to find out as I got older that they were all living in public housing, and the conditions of public housing were horrendous. Some of those other folks were also navigating predatory loans and contracts from Citibank. And my uncle, is someone who wasn't just the organizer. My uncle was someone who had both spent a period of his time in prison, juvenile, and he found organizing as an outlet. And to see him through all of the things that he's been through and our family's been through, to be organizing and building a movement was really important to me. So he's the vehicle for me getting to organizing. Just a couple of years ago, my uncle passed, and that was deeply disturbing. And it made me have to recall all the moments I had with him and the moments in which that contributed to me even wanting to be an organizer or even wanted to care about, there's a lot of folks in our communities. I came into this movement as a leader, someone who was working 2-3 jobs, and I didn't have time to care about other people. But the moment when I got the opportunity to get involved in the organization, I remember my uncle. But I vividly remember a story that is also mentioned in the book. It's me 6 years old. I think I was watching Power Rangers or baseball or something. And my uncle came running up the stairs. He was screaming my grandmother's name, couldn't find her. And behind him was 2 Chicago police officers. Without any words, they picked my uncle up and threw him out a 2-story window right in front of me. My uncle was paralyzed for 6 months on the left side of his body. And he recovered. And one of the first, this man was crazy. One of the first things he did was to help to organize a march against police brutality. So these are, this is both my grief, but it's also the inspiration that it takes to truly, I would say anyone can organize, but the passion in which it takes to organize comes from what organizers call as self-interest. So my self-interest in doing this work is not only to pay it forward because of what my ancestors and folks like my uncle have been through, but to be clearly, I don't want to sound too BS. Is like, for me, this work is retribution. My family was also a part of getting foreclosed on from Citibank. My mother and my father, all of my siblings have spent time either behind bars or victims to the criminal justice system. So when I show up in a room and I'm like, this is why I organize, it's because I am, deeply connected to folks who are still going through the struggle. And through all of that grief that, I make sure I'm using that. Through all of that grief, for me, the silver lining is the best thing about it, one of the best things you can have is an organized ability to relate to other people. So I tell both my staff and some of the members who come to the organization, it's like, to be vulnerable, because I'm going to be vulnerable, I'm going to wear these things that I've been through, the things that my family's been through on my sleeve, give folks the opportunity to understand that, you don't have to be shamed because of a predicament that you've been put in, either by a system, either by a crooked landlord, either by a horrendous boss. Let's use those stories to push forward. Let's use those stories not only to push forward for yourself, but to bring other folks in. So a lot of times we view grief as this thing that you can't escape it. It exists in your body and it eats away at you. But if you look at it in the correct way, the thing that you're able to do is to use that grief, and use that pain and turn it into passion to actually transform your life and the lives of the folks around you. So when I think about grief, I both think about the inspiration it gives me, but also the stories of folks who are no longer here with me, not just my uncle and my grandmother, but also previous organizers, the folks who from Ferguson to Baltimore to in 2020 Minneapolis, some of those folks aren't here with us anymore. So I push on for them, and that grief that I carry, I not only hold it as a torch, but I hold it. I not only hold it as a torch that I hold, but it's also a torch to pass. So folks don't feel that shame, and folks stand in their stories and stand in their power. So for me, that's how I view grief, and that's how I hope. And through your writing, that's what I hope a lot of folks take from your book is how to not only sit in the grief, but to actually be able to use it as a weapon for good. No, it's all good. I love you, Kat.
All right. We're connected. We're just visibilizing our threads.
Lifeline.
So, yeah, I think the grief story I want to tell, Sarah, is about me and my sister and the little girls we were and the women we didn't get to become. So when we were young, we also grew up poor, semi-working class, when the folks were working. And yeah, when I was like 7 or 8, my sister had gotten pretty involved in drug use, like heavy drug use, crack, cocaine, that sort of thing, and it meant that my parents, between the working, were also just like trying to track her down, trying to find her. She would be lost a lot of the time, what they call running away, but is actually just like human trafficking light, right? And so I think because of that, gang violence and drug use, who she was died who she could have been died around age 12. And for me, I think I tried to make myself disappear into that, to be the easier kid. And for a few years there, mostly all I did was read, right? But then I started to find my own way. And one of my sister's friends, actually, this guy, Damien, he ended up teaching me to play chess one summer, like in middle school. He was in high school. And it was amazing. But he was also caught up in some of the same business my sister was, in the life, right? And by the time I was in high school, he was kicked out. And so he wasn't there, my sister certainly wasn't, and by the time I got there and started making my own bad trouble, not the necessary kind, real unnecessary trouble, I never got caught, I never got held accountable, and a lot of that had to be because I was a cute little white girl who didn't I transferred out to the suburbs instead of going to school in North Minneapolis, like Damien had, and so he and I lost touch somewhere in there, and I like to say I tricked my way into a college. I cut a deal where if I could make A's, they would accept me, and so I did that. Again, an opportunity Damien didn't get, and while I graduated a few years later, I came back, and my sister is still talking to Damien, but she had lost track of him too because he had gotten into a big fight several times throughout our life growing up. He'd show up hiding from whoever in our basement. He ended up getting stabbed several times. And I think tried to get himself out of the life. And I didn't totally know what to do with that, right? Like that survivor's guilt that people talk about. I think there was some of that. But I also had turned off everything that had to do with being poor, everything that had to do with being from a family that struggled in this way. And it wasn't until I started organizing during Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Homes that I learned that actually it was being connected to that story and to that grief that I could build power.
Yeah, I think one of the things about grief is it will show you who you are. Sometimes in ways that we don't like, but you will figure out who you are when you lose something, and the things that will actually sort of turn you inside out when you lose. And in this book, I obviously write about losing people, but also about losing a home, about losing a job, a career, about losing the world, since I was reading about climate change. The end of the world, it feels closer than ever in a lot of ways. It's, and one of the things, right, is like trying to find the way to go on and to make that out of what we've got when it feels like you've lost everything. It can be this flip side, right? I've lost this, so now weirdly I've got nothing left to lose. It can be oddly empowering too. So one of the things that I write in the introduction to the book, I have sort of these 5 theses about grief. And the first one is that grief is a rupture, right? That it is like something that creates a break between what has come before and what has come after. And I was writing this having just read China Miéville's book on the Communist Manifesto, and he makes a lot out of the idea of rupture and the idea that, like, to really change the world, it will bring us to something like we can't see the other side of that from here. You try to make the change, you try to turn things upside down, say, but we can't really imagine what it will be like. And in a lot of ways, I think we're trying to make that change for people that will be coming after us, like we were talking about, right? I'm in my 40s, and I'm increasingly doubtful that, like, the better world that I've been fighting for will be, here for me. But maybe it'll be around for my niece, and maybe it'll be around for this kid sitting in the back there. That maybe we can make something better, but I won't get to see it, and I can't see it. But then I think about these moments and the 2020 uprisings and COVID, frankly, were one of those moments that suddenly everything has changed. And Kat, we were talking about Occupy, but like, I'm wondering if there are like other moments of rupture that you can think of that have been sort of politically transformative in our lifetimes, or maybe even historically, something that's like a touch point for either of you. I don't know. Kat, you're smiling at me, so I'm gonna make you go first this time.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I was thinking about the dandelion metaphor from Necessary Trouble. Okay, I don't know if I'll remember it, but I will try. So basically, this idea that, right, we have these movement moments, and they bud, and they grow into these beautiful, bright spots, but they have to die, right? That spring is going to end, it's going to go into summer and fall. And the beautiful part about that cycle is that dandelions make these giant puffs of seeds that blow everywhere and then hopefully grow into more and more, and then you end up with that field of dandelions, and it keeps growing. And that's what Occupy Wall Street was for many of us. Who came up through that moment, or who were already organizing during that time, but then got to meet, 80,000 new people overnight who wanted to do what they were doing, and join the movement.
I think I can point to many moments, but I think for me, I think a lot of people agree was what was it? I remember the day, November 7th, 2016. The day that Donald Trump was elected president. I think there was, I'm saying this while our governor is probably kicking J.D. Vance's ass, but I think hopefully, there's a couch on stage. But that night, and I think in the following days, everyone, regardless of where you were from, what you believed in, everyone who had their hopes and dreams on an America in which they would be seen, or some folks who just wanted to see Hillary Clinton get elected. I think that people, very quickly, for the first time in a very long time, that folks had to choose sides. We saw folks rise up and say resist. We saw the Women's March. We saw the rise of, I think about the, Black Bloc and Antifa and the further reaches of the left. But I think that the thing that I held to, the night of the election, I was with my friend, Mayer Soror, who is now in DC, and it was like 20 minutes before polls closed. I said, he's gonna win. She's like, why do you think he's going to win? Because if you know America like I know America, America has some very, very racist tendencies. And the beauty of, this is I want to say beauty, but the silver lining in Donald Trump being elected is that one of the things that I realized, and I think a lot of other organizers realize, is that the system in which we knew it was dying. When you push an animal into the corner, and you get an animal to a corner, what does it do? It fight like hell because it knows it's about to die. So what we're seeing right now is the last gasp of, I would say, the far right, or white supremacy, if you will. Our message, our movement's message was winning to that point. But the fact that folks were on the other side felt like this was it. If we don't take power now, and we saw that come back in 2021, January 6th. They can't win with their message. They don't know how to organize like we know how to organize. They don't have the love for their communities the way in which we have the love for their communities. They have love for ideologies. We have love for the community. And through that, we can stand anything. So I think that the moment in which that transformed where this country was going and our opportunity as both organizers and creatives and other folks in reach of the movement, it came through a man named Donald J. Trump. Now, there's a lot of harm that this man has created. A lot of harm is from folks who he has brought into his atmosphere have created. But it's given us a very clear picture of what we have to fight against and what exists in rooms in which we are not privy to, and the stories that are being told about us that are complete lies. So I think that in 2016, there was a timer that was started, and the work that we've done from then and from right now until I wouldn't even say November, for the next 10 to 15 years. Think about Roe versus Wade, think about affirmative action, think about if he wins, Project 2025 and the end of the Department of Education. All these things in which that we have to fight back against, that timer was pushed. They were moving forward, and we need to move forward as well. And I believe, I know we won't see it in our time, but I believe that was one of the most transformational moments that we're going to see over the next 50 years. Not because Donald Trump won, because what we're going to decide to do.
This is reminding me what you were saying there about the last gasps. 2004, I think, I was living in Denver, and that was after yet another ruptural moment, right, of September 11th, and then the forever wars that started then that are having a new, whatever right now as we speak. And I went to this thing called the Plea for Peace Tour, and it was a whole bunch of punk bands and whatever, and Saul Williams was playing. And he was doing songs and he was doing poems, and he would just sort of stand there and talk, And he was saying, he's like, I think this country is undergoing a cleanse. And when it undergoes a cleanse, all the scum rises to the top. And I've thought about that moment a lot in recent years, and that was one of those moments, right? It was like, okay, we got to get rid of George W. Bush, but it wasn't like the Vote for John Kerry tour, it was the Plea for Peace tour for a reason, right? Those moments, it really does strike me that, there's desperate attempt to sort of shove all of the things that we've been fighting for back in the box in recent years, right? So it's overturn Roe v. Wade. It's attempt to ban healthcare for trans kids, right? It's banning critical race theory in the schools, right? So, there's whole bookshelves in here. I'm just looking at 5 books that I can just see right now that are banned in Florida. It's desperate attempts to sort of shove everything back in the box, but the things that have been unleashed are not going back in the box. Some of them are us, and we're not going back in the box. Some of them are Hurricane Helene, which is also not going back in the box. And so we sort of have to figure out how to live with all this and figure out how to fight for all this. And what you were saying about we have love for the community, it actually leads me into my next question really well, which is one of the things, in an attempt to just make this book not completely depressing, one of the things that kept coming up when I was talking to people, talking to you all, talking to folks in Puerto Rico, talking to folks in Italy, was none of us are getting the care we need right now, like in this society, unless you are incredibly rich and you can hire it, none of us are getting the care that we need. And that sometimes makes organizing really hard, because I did a panel with Kelly Hayes and Iman Abdelhadi and Lydia Palo-Hobbs a few weeks ago, and Kelly was like, you've all been in that organizing space where like the trauma response just goes like ricocheting around the room, and suddenly everybody is triggering everybody else, and like suddenly you can't get anything done because everybody is just like. And I think it was Iman who said, like, and we take it out on the people who are closest to us because we know they feel, right? Like, I know that all of you care about the stuff that we're here talking about. And so it'd be easy for me to make you all feel awful by talking about, various deaths and wars and all the fun things that I'm already talking about. And so that can feel like power, But to get those trauma responses out of the organizing space, to be able to do the work we do, we also need to think about how we're building the spaces where we are cared for. And the spaces that aren't the workspace, but that are nevertheless sort of connected to and connecting to the movement, where we can talk and cry and laugh and process and just be human. And so I know, again, that both of you were thinking about that when we last spoke, so I wonder if you have any thoughts or maybe any practices that you've been developing or you've seen people developing in the interim that you want to share.
Well, funny enough, Rod and I are helping facilitate a 3-day organizer training right now with some of the groups that are lined attending the Soil, the organization I work for. So we have staff organizers from Setul. Shout out to Setul in the house. The Low-Wage Workers Center in South Minneapolis. Renters United for Justice, New Justice Project, SEIU Local 26, representing service workers, and Unidos Minnesota, an immigration reform group. Okay, that's all the people. So we've got about a dozen full-time organizers, and we're dedicating 3 days for them to do deep reflection on how oppression they've experienced and harm they've been witness to or caused or been around is getting in the way of them building power. And so the idea is we're taking out our struggle in all the time in unintentional ways if we don't digest those experiences, right? We're all walking around with this indigestion, and so let's take these 3 days to go deep. And so we say, all right, let's teach you how to have a one-to-one organizing conversation. But instead of just doing the skills training, we're doing the work to talk about what's getting in the way of having those deep and meaningful relationship building one-to-ones. And so it's an incredible gift that people are willing to be this vulnerable and move by the end of the training. So that's one practice, is setting up a lot more of these, especially post-pandemic. We weren't able to have as many of these deep organizer trainings in a good way. One guy actually talked to me after, he's like, I went to this 3-day organizer training. I won't say the name of the organization that provided it, but it was virtual, and I was like, whoa, I can't imagine doing this deep soul work with 20 other people on Zoom. No one, he said, I felt humiliated and all these, and I was like, yeah, I bet. Like, no one would be there to hold your hand as you talk about that bad thing that happened and how you're gonna not be afraid of power anymore, And so that's one way that I'm thinking about how we move. Like, we can't be victims. Like, I refuse to believe that. Like, we have to be powerful survivors and warriors, and this is how we convince each other that we can be. And
That's one way too. That's one of the best ways.
Get in the hug.
There's this old adage that we use in organizing. I think they should.
No.
Don't give him the mic.
You'll just hear the Smurf song.
I would love that. This is an old adage that we say in organizing: is our duty is to be transformed through the service of the work. And what that means is, it's not only about, yes, let's transform our communities. Let's make sure that we stop climate change. Let's ensure that everyone has a living wage. Let's ensure that women have all the reproductive rights that they deserve and are entitled to. Let's make sure that we have an adequate response to folks who are unhoused. But the one thing that like 2 years ago, I was talking to a friend and he stopped me because I was complaining about all the horrible things happening in my life, all the horrible things that I had, how I was feeling about work and where our organization was at. And he said, when is the last time you actually looked in the mirror and told yourself, I love you? Something as simple as that. And that might sound very esoteric. I will cuss, but we got some kids in the room. But that might sound very esoteric. But how often do we spend time like really thinking about our bodies? He's good. He's digging what I'm saying. How often do we look at ourselves like and spend time in the mirror, just thinking about what we've been through, where we've been, and where we want to go, and who we want to go with? We spend so much time just. Alarm clock goes off. Okay, coffee. Not for Sarah. She doesn't drink coffee anymore. Coffee, food, shower, off to work. But how often do we actually ask ourselves, how are we and how are we feeling in our bodies? My wonderful partner who's right there, she always asks me, every day she asks me, how do you feel about yourself? And it was weird as hell when the first time she asked me that. I'm like, she's a teacher, so that makes sense. And I had to really start digging into that. Like, how do I feel about myself? So, one of the most transformative practices that you can seek out is like, how do we really learn ourselves? We all want to read Sarah's book. We all have other books that we want to read. We all watch YouTube. Some of us, I guess. YouTube's old. I sound old. But how often do we tell ourselves our story? Our story. Not the story of the world, but our story. And what connections that we have to our story. And what do we remember? And what hurts? And what gives us joy? And then the other thing is like, this one's pretty simple. I've built into my schedule. Like before I got here, I was like, when I walked up, I was like, Sarah, I just had a nap. She's like, oh, I can't take naps.
Yeah.
But the opportunity to take rest and take respite. Capitalism and the world around us doesn't afford us the opportunity to rest. And the folks who we organize, they don't have that opportunity. And so it's a privilege for me to be able to take 30 minutes out the day and a rest so I can think clearly and do this work that I care so much about. But for me, the two practices are telling yourself about how you feel about yourself and telling yourself your story, and then just making sure that you are doing. It might not be a nap for you. It might be an extra donut. It might be a piece of avocado. It might be some new gym shoes or calling your mom. But like, we need to find the thing that sets us on the right course. And I think that for me, those are the two things. It's a nap and looking in the mirror and saying, hey, I love you.
Well, I love you both. It's making me think about one of the other amazing organizers who's in this book, Al Lewis, who's in Memphis. And he and I had this amazing conversation. I had so many good conversations for this book. And he was saying to me at one point, he's like, people would always ask me what's wrong, and I thought that meant that I was wrong. And nobody ever asked me what happened to you. And like how different a story that was, because it was like, well, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? Why are you using drugs? Why are you doing whatever? And it's like, oh, then there's something wrong with me. But when somebody finally looked him in the eye and said, what happened? That was this moment that he was like, oh, right, stuff happened. And the thing that Rob was just saying about time, right? That like two more of my sort of theses on grief. One is that like grief is not work, and the other is that capitalism can't abide grief. And both of those are about time, right? Because grief like screws with your experience of time. It is not neat and easy stages, and it is not whatever. And like the only thing, because everybody needs different things when they're grieving, but like the one thing we all will need is time for it. And that time won't even be consistent. It's not like you can just have a week off after someone dies and then you'll be okay. You might be fine that week. You might actually feel pretty good that week. And then like 6 months later, all of a sudden you can't get out of bed. Or then 6 months later, you can't get out of bed for a couple of days, and then you get up and you're fine again. And then 3 years later, you can't get out of bed for a week. And that really screws with the schedule of work that we're all on. Even just a regular 9 to 5, but like who in here actually works a regular 9 to 5? Like what is that anymore? I certainly don't. My therapist was giving me a list of like things I have to do now because I work from home, and it was like put on actual clothes and go sit at your desk and make it like you're going to an office rather than just like rolling out of bed and like never ending, right? But yeah, and these questions of sort of rest and time and all of that are so central, I think, to like all of the work we're doing, and this question of like where can we get time to do things. Anyway, I wanted to open up and see if we have any questions from all of you lovely people for any and all of us. Anybody? I can just keep talking to these two for a while, but like, yeah.
Question. Rod and Kat, and Sarah too, but especially Rod and Kat, who, been here in the Twin Cities through 2020, and as I was too, I find it, I still don't know how to deal with other people from outside our community's opinions and reactions and, their own feelings that they need to process about what happened here in 2020. And I hadn't really formed the end of my question, but I just wonder if anyone has any comments on when you have a more up-close experience of something that is so public and so big culturally, and how you kind of parse that and manage that.
That is a really good question, Jillian. You've had so long to ask me that question, but you asked me here. Yeah, but I love you, Jillian. Not to use the old beat down quote, but Martin Luther King said that a riot is the voice of the unheard. And someone who, I was a part of a bunch of work that happened around police accountability here in Minneapolis over, previous to 2020. Everything from Terrence Franklin being murdered by police not even a mile from here to Jamar Clark in the occupation of the 4th Precinct. And for me, that moment, I was a brand new organizer. I started organizing in early 2015. And radical for me was like telling your story in front of City Hall. But to see some of my friends and folks who I love dear, folks who are not in this room, Michael McDowell, Candace Montgomery, Lena Gardner, even Misha McGrim, some of these folks who held space outside of a precinct because Jamar Clark, I don't know if everyone knows the story of Jamar Clark, but he was murdered November 15th, 2016 by the Minneapolis Police Department. And from that moment, when folks held space inside of the atrium, and what outside of that grew was tents came, fire started, music played, and yes, alcohol flowed to stay warm. It was in the midst of November. So when I think about then and then a year later, Philando Castile was murdered in Falcon Heights. And the work that was done around that, from the shutdown of the Mall of America to the shutdown of the MSP airport. So what happened in 2020? There's a person. Her name is Raisha Williams. She said in front of the government center, downtown Minneapolis, when it was like 20, when they shut down the 4th Precinct and we did a big march, and she said, "We are the reason in which the city did not burn." And it makes me think about over the past, all those years, all the folks who had burned out, all the folks who held these stories and held this knowledge and held this militant belief that through traditional organizing and through radical tactics, controlled and strategic tactics, that we can make change. So when I came back in 2020, I was in Detroit. I hopped on a flight I bought a flight like 20 minutes after I saw the video. Someone sent me the video. I bought a flight. I came back here, and when I got on the ground, like 2 days later, everything was burning, and I saw folks in the streets marching, and I saw folks who I'd never seen in my life in any type of organizing room, like tears in their eyes, fighting against tear gas and rubber bullets, and like for me, I was fucking proud. Because we had, not to keep using sayings, but Tupac says this thing where it's like, if I'm at your door and I'm knocking on your door and you open the door and I see a bunch of food and I'm out here starving, and it's gonna be a knock, and then it's gonna be a bang, and then the next time when we're coming, we're kicking the door down. And that's the belief that, going back to what MLK said, the riot is the voice of the unheard. So what we saw in 2020 was an uprising. And I had never seen anything like that. And what was said in that moment by communities is like, we aren't going back. We will not let this moment pass us, and we will not let our dear brother George Floyd be just another name, or just another tombstone. And from that moment, and from the buildings that burned, and the folks who were radicalized, from folks who work for neighborhood associations to grandmothers who are radicalized into this movement that we use to seek freedom and liberation, that spread all over the world. So the questions that we were asking about our safety and what we deserve in our city were the same questions that were being asked around the world. So it wasn't about Minneapolis, lighting the torch, but it was Minneapolis lighting the torch and giving folks permission to say, I am hurting and I want to be seen, and what are you gonna do about it? So yeah, that's it.
I think when it comes to people who aren't here, who come here to do a pilgrimage at George Floyd Square, or who want to know about it and whatnot, I'm always, well, first tell me what was happening where you were, so that I have the context of where you're coming from. And I will get a little defensive if anybody has any criticism of anything that happened in our city. Because I'm like, you weren't here. You don't know. And yes, there were some annoying people that I would have used a different word than annoying if my children weren't here. But no, of course, people don't understand what it was like to be here, but there were riots in other places. There were communities that came together to defend themselves from white supremacists. But the main thing I always want to make sure people are clear about, and I end up in this mission to make sure people know, is how organized and militant the white supremacists were during that time. Because the media truly did not capture it. And shout out to my wife, she and I helped start this thing, the Minneapolis Fire Squad, where people could call in and report bombs and fires and that might impact their house. Well, we didn't know that it was bombs. We were just like, there's these strange 50-gallon drums now all of a sudden, these metal drums. And so we were like, all right, let's bring one to the fire department and see what they want to do to dispose of it. We thought it was just some oil, and they're like, you need to stop picking these up. These are rigged to explode. And we're like, excuse me, you want me to leave this here? How is that better? It's not, obviously. But they were organized in blocks. So there were these mason jars at different areas. Anyway, so I always bring people on that tour of here's one. And I think that's the main thing so I feel that defensiveness too, Jill. But I'm also but we need to understand. They were organized and we were reacting. And that was what was wild to me.
Thank you.
And just as one of those people who wasn't here, but and wasn't surprised that it was Minneapolis that lit the spark, because I knew y'all and some of you other folks in here, and well, I didn't know you yet, but but like, when I reached out to Situl actually, and it was like, oh, our office is on the block where that happened. I was like, yeah, right, of course. That there was this incredible movement in Minneapolis already that had laid the groundwork for people to be able to respond to this.
Do you remember Bobby Hole? by any
Yeah.
chance?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same block where Bobby Hole lives.
Yes, yeah,
It's like where a bunch of movement moments have happened.
right,
Like right there at 38 in Chicago.
yeah.
So yeah, it felt on time.
Yeah, and it's hard because it's like there are not enough journalists who are telling the story well, basically. And I was 2 years too late to actually be able to come out here. But yeah. Well, let's hope so. Yeah, I got it. I'm here and then what I see it.
My question is about like spaces and grief and sort of like the geography of grief. And I think so many of the I think most people are not given accessible grief practices, but when they are, it sort of falls more in the personal and friends and family section. And I'm personally interested in public spaces for grief and importance and bigger art projects that are inviting people into that and inviting people into connection with each other through the aspect of grief. And I'm wondering, in your lives and your experience, especially working in this book, what other places, what other different case studies of space and grief, especially public space. And you mentioned New Orleans. I think that's a really good example, and we have that a little bit in Minneapolis. But yeah, just wondering how that can help.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I did come here and met up with Kat at the Situl and IX office, and then Jen Arnold and I walked down to where there was that display of the tombstones, right? That was and it was everybody, and I was just walking through it going oh, this one. There's Henry Glover, who was killed in New Orleans after Katrina, right? There's Emmett Till, right? There are all these names that I knew, and going oh, wow, this is an amazing space that has been built here that is, yeah, and there aren't enough of those, right? A lot of the memorials in New Orleans are gone. And one of the interesting things in the book, the first memorial I saw to COVID that was specifically to essential workers from COVID was in Barnsley, which is in the north of England, which is where the United Mine, it's the, why am I blanking on the Mine Workers Union in Britain? Anyway, National Union of Mine Workers, that's what it is, the NUM. UMWA is here. That's where their headquarters is. And the Miners Union has been building memorials for years and years, but they started really going up after the miners' strike in the 80s and after they closed down the mining industry. So there's this incredible culture there, sort of after the industry is gone, of mourning the disasters and the people who were killed down the mines, but also sort of mourning the loss of the industry in this really, really interesting way. And Chris Kitchen, who is the president of the NUM, which has I think fewer than 100 active members now. There's one mine in Wales somewhere that I think might be closing as we speak. And basically what his job is to fight for healthcare for retired miners who all have obviously various health issues from having been miners, and then to go to all these memorials every year. And that culture is in that union and a few others. I think the Mine Workers Union here does have something somewhat similar. But without a union to build those spaces, where are we building them, right? Without the movement and the organizations building those spaces. I don't think there are that many others that I can think of.
I think because so much of our organizing is, at least for me and Rod, isn't as attached to faith institutions where a lot of people go for mourning. There is sometimes that absence, and the vigil as direct action is probably the closest my work has come to public grief spaces. Yeah, I think that not having as many union halls and church, synagogue, mosque halls, temple halls to go to makes that need of like the third space for grief all the more necessary. So thanks for that question.
Actually, was thinking of one more thing because it is about to be Rosh Hashanah again. That like one of the things that's been really hard, and actually I haven't read the article yet, but in these times published a piece by Shane Burley today that sort of anti-Zionist and Israel critical Jews are being pushed out of Jewish spaces and Jewish communal institutions, and so we're literally losing the spaces that we would go to grieve because we're not welcome in them because we're grieving the wrong people right now. Because we're grieving Palestinian lives and now Lebanese lives and Syrian lives, and like, you know, we're grieving the wrong people, so we're losing that community. And what does it mean to try to build those institutions again? So that's an intense one. Yeah, sir.
I've got, excuse me, 2 questions. Brad, who are you organizing for? I'm a little ignorant of your background.
I found an organization called the New Justice Project Minnesota. So we organize low-income and no-income Black Minnesotans throughout the metro.
Okay, what's your name again?
The New Justice Project Minnesota. New
Justice.
Justice. Yeah.
Okay. And Sarah, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Why do you live in New Orleans?
As in I should move to Minneapolis?
No, no.
Why do I live in New
Actually, you
Orleans?
should.
Yeah, I mean, well, look, I love it here.
Or
It's like
even-
I'm changing
even-
my question. I can't
even
deal with the
better
winter
Duluth,
anymore.
Even better Duluth.
Yeah, I mean, so New Orleans, I went to school there. I started at Tulane, and then I hated Tulane, but I loved New Orleans, so I
Yeah.
transferred to Loyola New Orleans.
Uh-huh.
And then I left in 2002 after I finished my undergrad,
Uh-huh.
and I spent the sort of lockdown winter, 2020, 2021, like locked alone in an apartment in New York, which was miserable,
Ugh.
doing a bunch of Zoom events, including one for Magers Quinn, because my book came out in the middle of all that. And by the end of that winter, I was so miserable, and I was like, okay, if we're gonna keep having like periodic lockdowns for a while, I need to be somewhere where I can be outside. And so I went down to New Orleans, and I was, I still had friends there friends of mine from 20 years ago, and a friend of mine from New York had moved there recently, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna go for like 6 weeks, and I'm gonna be like, I'm either gonna love it and be like, why did I ever leave? Or I'm gonna be like, get me out of here, there's too many ghosts. And I stayed. So clearly I loved it. I actually just did a launch event there last week, hosted by my friend Thomas, who lived on the same floor as me our freshman year at Tulane. And I've been joking that he's responsible for all of this because he's the one who told me that the unlisted poli-sci 301 class was actually a class on Marx. So, he totally started me off on a path. But it's been really cool to be like, oh, this friend, he's a labor historian now. We didn't talk for most of the last 20 years, but he also dragged me along to the Southern Labor Studies Association last week in Chattanooga, which was great. And then the other thing about it is just like, it's gonna sink, and I'm well aware of that. It's kind of not a long-term proposition to be there, but I wanted to be there again before it's gone. And I was saying there aren't enough journalists who cover movement stuff. There really aren't any in the South. So it's kind of nice to be there. And, I was just in Chattanooga hanging out with some of the UAW workers who won their union at Volkswagen. Writing about, there's a union drive at a big hospital in New Orleans right now, and like the union busting is horrific. There's a lot of good stories in the South that it turned out nobody was telling.
For me, it's Frenchman Street.
There's also
the
that.
club's on Frenchman Street.
It's also the music, and also,
You got it. Yeah.
No, a friend, new friend actually that I just met at this conference who studies informal labor in New Orleans, and I made a joke about like it's a place where people move to avoid getting a real job, and that's actually what her dissertation is on. She's studying like how people, they call it a job, right? I don't want to get a job, so like, but sometimes I have to get a job. But most of the time it's cobbling together a couple bartending shifts and some shifts playing music and selling your art. And What?
Is it Petty Bikes?
She used to be a penny cab driver. Yep, exactly. You were just in New Orleans recently,
Yes.
hanging out with the Step Up Louisiana folks.
Yes, that was the time. Freshman Street, though, right?
Yes. There are so many things. Yeah. Anybody? One more? No? Yeah. Sure, well.
Not a question as much as just a
Can I see a
comment
book from it?
of, just noting that today is the 3-year anniversary of oil starting to flow through a pipeline that was built in northern Minnesota that,
Oh, yeah.
you know, a lot of people in this,
Okay.
city, like, you know, built some of their organizing lives around and.
Yeah.
So,
Talk about grief, right?
and in the absence of a space to,
To
all
mourn
come
that.
together and connect, some of us are gonna go down to the river after that.
Oh.
After this event, but yeah, just thought about this as a two grief night, but
Yeah.
appreciate like even spaces like this where people are thinking about those types of things.
Thank you. Yeah, the pipelines, I wasn't here for that one, but I write about Standing Rock in the book, because I did go to Standing Rock when that was, yeah, and there's sure oil still flowing through that one too. We're doing great, guys. Western North Carolina's underwater, but we need more oil pipelines. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining me. Thank everyone for all of the work you're doing to unfuck this world. We're trying.
Amen.
We're trying. All right. Let's sign some books.
Ooh.
I'm gonna sign some books.
Let's go get our books signed by Sarah.